Thanks for tuning in to the Urban Scope podcast. I'm back with another episode. And of course, I will be discussing, does Drake have a classic album? Now, I've seen this discussion or debate on My Expert Opinion with Matt Hoffa. And of course, Rory and Maul were on the show. And they had this discussion. And of course, they were going to bring up Drake because Maul was on the show, as they talked about before. And the argument was centered around, does Drake have a classic album, which is something that I'm always looking to embrace and debate about classic albums, because classic albums is such a loose discussion. It's something that is so subjective, and it really is difficult to define. And it's about your definition, because everyone has their own definition of classic, because everyone has their own palette for music. Everyone has their own taste. So, and we know Drake's run was one of the longest runs in history, but having a long run doesn't guarantee that you have a classic album, because they mentioned a couple people that they said don't have classic albums. Fabulous, Jadakiss. Of course, this is more East Coast bias. But guys like those, they saying they don't really have classic albums. Now they might have classic songs, definitely have classic moments, especially Jadakiss with the verses, and Fabulous, his classic moments with the "I'm So Into You" with the Tamia song, and it's still played to today, and it's a timeless classic. But does he have a class? Do they have classic bodies of works? And they didn't seem to think so. Most of them. But Drake, with his countless features, his projects, his compilate or his collab albums with Future and with 21 Savage and with Party Next Door, chart topping success. Does he have a classic album? Um, but I had to think about the definition of classic if we want to get to the root of this thing, because what defines a classic album? And I looked at an AI generated definition, which says defines classic as a lasting cultural impact, timeless sound, high level artistry, which is a pretty good definition. But I wanted to add another element, especially specifically to hip hop. Does it have a classic album cover? I know this is not, it doesn't encompass everything, but I think it should be part of the equation, because if you want to think about classic album covers, not even just hip hop, think about the Nirvana album cover. Think about the album cover from Bruce Springsteen, Born in America or Born in USA or whatever it is. That album cover. You want to think about the Jay-Z Blueprint album cover. You want to think about the Nas or the Biggie debut albums with the face covers, or with the child, with their, like, pretty much their adolescence pictures on them. Everybody started doing that. Even Lil Wayne came out 20 plus years later and put his baby picture on the album cover. So a lot of artists now are putting their, childhood pictures on their album cover as an album cover. It set a trend. So I think the album cover aspect has to have a piece to it, which I'll get into a little bit later about Drake. But that's one of those things I was thinking about. Even like a Lil Kim album cover that she put out that was pretty provocative. A lot of artists, they made it okay for, or more warming to, for other artists to do album covers like that. But people, album covers are a big part in hip hop and what the influence is as well. So I think that should be a part of the equation, no doubt. Um, but you notice that a part of a classic album, they didn't mention sales, because, and I was thinking about this, that every album Drake would release would have been a classic if sales is a part of that, but I don't think sales is a part of a classic album. It can help, but I don't think it has any bearings on making it a classic, because sales does not dictate culture, and culture does not dictate sales. So, um, that's one of the things I was thinking about. And then also, classic albums define hip hop. So, in whether it be an era or it be a moment in time. So, going all the way back to Nas's Illmatic, it's one of those albums that you can still play today. It's timeless. It's not outdated. Even if he says the year on it or whatever, it's still music that you can still relate to. It's something that's not really outdated. And that's what a classic album is. The sound doesn't sound out of place. You can like, wow, why did they say that? That doesn't make sense now. It's one of those type of deals. Even the Jay Z Blueprint or Jay Z Reasonable Doubt. If you want to go back to his first album, that album you can still listen to it today, and it sound like an artist can put that out today, and it still have the same effect. So does Drake have one of those? Is what I was thinking. And by definition, I think he probably has two classic albums for I guess the era because one of the definition is lasting cultural impact. And I don't think it's too soon to tell if they really have lasting cultural impact. Now, for the impact that they've released in the era that they released, sure. But everything past 2016 is not a classic album from Drake. Now, of course, it's like I said before, it's too early to tell, but those two albums, Thank Me Later and Take Care, I think those would be if he has classic, are those 2. Um, because Thank Me Later, in the context of things, he had all of this buzz around him for being signed to Lil Wayne and Young Money and Cash Money, having the Birdman co-sign, having these mixtapes and having all these features and all this great talent, but could he deliver on it? And, Thank Me Later, he delivered on his talent that he had and showed that he actually belonged. But as people say, if you want to be great, you're gonna have to win more than one in a row in terms of championships. You got to do it more than once because greatness is not once, it's more than that, it's consistency. And he was able to do that throughout his career from the sound that he had as well. Even though the sound that he had, he didn't originate it, he helped made it more acceptable for other artists behind him and created a whole, emo thing. Him and Kid Cudi, to an effect, helped create both this sound. Um, Behind what they were able to do and being able to sing and rap, made it a lot comfortable for a lot of artists to do it because artists before them, other than a Lauryn Hill, i.e., a Nas, a Jay Z, a Biggie, Tupac, all of these guys, they didn't rap and sing really. They just rapped and they had a woman on the hook or some guy on the hook singing. But these guys were able to be a one stop shop and do it both. And Drake made it more acceptable for artists to do that. Um, create but I don't think he created a timeless sound, but I think he had created timeless those albums could be considered, classics just because of the time that they were in, but I think as time goes along, we'll see if those actually become classics, but for the sake of argument, I think Thank Me Later and Take Care will be the 2 classic albums that he would have if you wanna give him credit for by that definition, because lasting cultural impact, he hasn't been out long enough to figure that one out. Because most of the people who have classic albums, usually those albums are 20, 30 years old. Now Drake is coming upon the 20-year mark with I think, would Thank Me Later, because I believe it was released in 2010, which in 2030 we'll see what's the consensus about it, but those albums would be classic just for the sake of being unbiased, I wanna say, because if you talk about the albums that define hip hop and that you can't tell the story of hip hop without there's not a Drake album that you can say is fits that mold. There's not an album that you can say in Drake's discography that said, "Hey, the story of 2010, tell me the story of 2010." Now, there's songs that you can't Drake songs that you can't tell the story of hip hop about without, but there's not a Drake project in his discography that you can go to a specific decade or a specific year that you can't tell the story without. And hence why he doesn't have a lot of Grammys, in my opinion, is because he doesn't make a lot of timeless music. Now, Kendrick Lamar has a lot because, and a lot of people give him flack for having so many, but it's because he creates timeless music and he makes music that appeals to the masses. Well, not to the masses, but to people who matter, people that know he's making songs because they're coming from a genuine place and not just to make something for people to dance to and people to vibe to and people to talk to women to and things like that. He actually has substance to his music and he actually has things that he's saying, and also he's writing his own music. That's a factor as well. So I don't think Drake has an album that you can say that you can't live without, or you can't tell the story of hip hop without. But he does have song like albums that are very important to his ascension and important to the time and era that they were made. But as far as telling the story of hip hop without he doesn't have Me Against the World or Illmatic or Blueprint or Reasonable Doubt or Biggie's Ready to Die, or for that matter, he doesn't have any of a Common B album. He doesn't have that in his discography. I actually think Common has more classic albums than Drake because Common is an underrated rapper, but what his influence has, especially with I Used to Love Her and what Common B did and like Water for Chocolate, even Finding Forever, which a lot of people give flack for, which is very Kanye West heavily influenced produced music, had a lot of influence on people that were coming up in the industry. No one said, I never heard anyone say, well, Drake inspired me to do this. They inspired him to, people to get money and people to be famous. But as far as artistry, I never seen anyone really say that. So I don't think he really has, for his discography, he has two classic. But as far as terms of hip hop and a global aspect, I don't think he has any classic albums. He has classic moments and classic songs, definitely classic features, which he has a lot of those. But he doesn't have a classic album. So tell me what your thoughts about Drake having a classic album. And until next time, see you next time.